purpose. What are the form, content, and extent of documentation? Its summary, audit file, assembly, ownership, and practically how these concepts are studied through examples. So, objective of audit documentation is first to provide a sufficient and appropriate record on the basis of auditor's report, and it gives the evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with essays and applicable legal regulatory requirements. So here is one representation given here. So it is property of the auditor. That is, this audit documentation is property of the auditor. Audit documentation is an audit evidence which has to be appropriate and sufficient. That is both quality and quantity wise. Again, audit documentation comprises of audit file and completion memorandum. So this is one example. Please go through it. We'll start with essay. The relevant essay for this chapter is essay 230. That is audit documentation, and it deals with the auditor's responsibility to prepare audit documentation. So preparation of financial statements is management's responsibility, but checking or reviewing or evaluating those and to give review is auditor's responsibility. Now, to do this thing, it is auditor's responsibility to collect evidence while doing audit, and for this purpose, evidence in written form, that is audit documentation, is very, very important. So we'll first of all see what is the definition of audit documentation. So it is an evidence audit documentation refers to record of audit procedures performed, relevant audit evidence obtained, and conclusions the auditors reach. So three steps here: record of audit procedures performed, relevant audit evidence obtained, and conclusion the auditor reached. So objective of the auditor. So the objective of auditor is to prepare documentation that provides a sufficient and appropriate record on the basis of auditor's report and evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with standards on auditing, that is essays and applicable legal and regulatory requirement. So this same thing is given in this diagram for A and B. Now we'll see what is nature of audit documentation. So audit documentation provides an evidence of the auditor's basis for a conclusion about the achievement of overall objectives, and it is evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with standards on auditing and applicable legal and regulatory requirements. Now, following are the purposes of audit documentation. First of all, it assists the engagement team to plan and perform the audit, assisting members of the engagement team to direct and supervise the audit, enabling the engagement team to be accountable for its work, retaining a record of matters that is in a written form containing significance to future audits, and enabling the conduct of quality control review and inspections in accordance with SQC. So we'll see form, content, and extent of audit documentation. So auditor shall prepare audit documentation that has to be sufficient, and an experienced auditor which has no previous connection with the audit. So this audit documentation helps the auditor to understand the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures performed, the results of those audit procedures performed, and the audit evidence obtained, and significant matters which arise during the audit and the conclusions reached thereon, and significant professional judgments made in reaching those conclusions. So further, in documenting the NTE, that is nature, timing, and extent, auditor will record all the characteristics of specific items, who performed the audit work, who reviewed the audit work performed, and the date and extent of such review. So the auditor shall discuss significant matters with management, those charged with governance and others, including nature of significant matters. And if the auditor identifies information that is inconsistent with the auditor's final conclusion regarding a significant matter, the auditor shall document how to address this problem. So is this thing clear so far?
Yeah, ma'am.
Any doubt in this?
No doubts, ma'am.
Okay. Next, we will see the form, content, and extent. It depends upon the 7 factors. Those are, so the nature and complexity of the entity. The larger the entity, documentation has to be more in volume. Again, if it is complex in nature, so the number of functions and processes that company has, the more number of documentation files the auditor has to make. Second is the nature of the audit procedures to be performed. The whether audit procedure has to be physically verified, it has to be verified by an expert, it has to be verified by recalculation. What is the type of audit procedure that has to be done? That comes under second point. Then the risk of material misstatement, whether there can be larger uh, chances of occurrence of error or fraud in calculation of cash or inventory. What are the risk areas? So this is also one of the factor. Significance of the audit evidence obtained. Audit evidence, whatever is obtained inside the company or from outside the company, what is its importance? Nature and extent of exceptions identified, and the need to document a conclusion or the basis for a conclusion not readily determinable. Seventh point is the audit methodology and tools used. So we'll see the examples of audit documentation. So audit documentation may be recorded on paper or on electronic media. Example is given here. Audit documentation include audit programs, analysis, issues memoranda, summaries of significant matters, letters of confirmation and representation, checklist, correspondence, including email concerning significant matters. So the auditor may include copies of entities record, and audit documentation is not a substitute for the entity's accounting records. Even though the auditor is maintaining audit documentation, company or the entity cannot use it as a substitute for it accounting records. Company has to maintain its accounting record. That is what is explained here. The auditor need not include in audit documentation superseded drafts of working papers and financial statements that reflect incomplete or preliminary thinking, previous copies, and duplicate of documents. So it is upon professional judgment of auditor precisely what things are included. Again, those points which we saw here are given in this diagram format: audit program, analysis, issue memoranda, summaries of significant matters, letters, checklist, and correspondence. So audit documentation has to be prepared on a timely basis, say daily or weekly or semi-annually, depending. So documentation prepared after the audit work is less accurate than documentation which is prepared at the time of work. Simultaneously, the steps are carried out to conduct audit. It is always advisable to maintain this documentation then and thereon, rather than maintaining a file after the audit. This is what 1.7 says. 1.8 explains as audit file. It can be defined as one or more folders or storage medias, which can be both in physical or electronic form, which contains the records that comprise the audit documentation for a specific engagement. So what is audit file? Audit file is one or more folders or other storage media that can be in physical or electronic form containing record and the documentation for a specific engagement. Again, please go through the illustration. We see assembly of the final audit file. So after maintaining, all the documentations which has been done, at the end, a final audit file has to be maintained and done for a complete administrative purpose. So here, SQC1 quality control for firms tells us it requires firms to establish policies and procedures for timely completion of assembly of audit files. Also, there is an appropriate time limit within which the complete assembly of final audit file is ordinarily, which is not more than 60 days after the date of auditor's report. So, this completion of assembly of audit file after the audit report is an administrative process that does not include any new performance of audit procedures, but it is just assembling all the documentations which have been collected earlier. If, however, any changes are required, that should be done. Examples of those changes are deleting or discarding superseded documentation, which are now no longer in use, sorting, collating, and cross referencing working papers, signing off a completion checklist relating to assembly process, and documenting audit evidence that the auditor has obtained, discussed, and agreed with the relevant members of the engagement team before the date of the auditor's report. So after the assembly of the final audit file is completed, auditor shall not delete or discard documentation before the end of its retention period. So SQC1 here requires firm to establish policies and procedure for retention documentation. Now we see documentation of significant matters and related significant professional judgments. So these significant matters require objective analysis of the facts and circumstances. Examples are matters that give rise to significant risk. First, result of audit procedure indicating that the financial statement could be materially misstated, or there is a need to revise the auditor's previous assessment, circumstances that cause the auditor significant difficulty in applying necessary audit procedures, and findings that could result in modification to the audit opinion, that is, inclusion of emphasis of matter paragraph in the auditor's report. So some examples of circumstances in which which is appropriate to prepare audit documentation relating to use of professional judgment are the rationale of the auditor's conclusion. That is again his point of view, his thinking that the auditor considers necessary or significant in the context of the particular or respective engagement. The basis for auditor's conclusion on reasonableness of are areas of subjective judgment. Example, accounting estimates, provisions and all. Then we see completion memorandum or audit documentation summary. So what is this completion memorandum? So auditor may at time consider it helpful to prepare and retain as part of audit documentation a summary. And what does that summary describes? The significant matters that are identified during the audit and how they were addressed. So such a summary, that is this completion memorandum, it facilitates effective and efficient review and inspection of documentation. This is particularly for large and complex audits. Again, ownership of audit documentation. So, as per standard on quality control, it provides, unless otherwise specified, audit documentation is the property of the auditor. So, auditor may at his discretion or decision make portions, extract from or audit documentation, various documentation available to clients provided that do not undermine the validity of this work performed. So again, we see here ownership of audit documentation lies with this auditor. All right, maybe by this we have ended this chapter. It is very